This is English for Politics and Administration, and we are now on class number 12, which is going to be on public policy. And we'll start, as per usual, with a little cartoon here, which I came across. I think this was from Politico or somewhere. And normally in class I would ask you to describe what we can see, but you're not here, so I'll do it for you. Okay, so we can see here. This is a reference to Joe Biden's decision to hold, as you can see in the picture here, a summit for democracy. And if we were in class, my first question would be to ask you what exactly is a summit? And like the Polish, the word szczyt can either mean like the summit of a mountain, the top of a mountain, or sometimes we use it in terms of international relations and diplomacy to describe a high-level meeting, usually involving heads of governments, so presidents, prime ministers, people like that. Summit, I think, because as a reference to that they are the people at the top, as it were. And we can see here a sign saying "Welcome Summit for Democracy." And in the background, obviously, we can see a picture of Donald Trump in full uniform with a red hat, MAGA wrapped across his uniform, Make America Great Again. Behind him, we can see a picture of the insurrection on the Capitol, which was about a year ago, wasn't it? January the 6th. One of the people holding a placard there saying "Stop the Steal." The QAnon shaman as well in the corner there. I think I can point to him. There he is. A parade of Trump supporters with their torches as well. Below here, I've probably asked you this question before, but we've got a picture of an elephant strangling a donkey there. These are obviously the symbols, which they often appear in cartoons, the symbols of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. So the Republicans being the elephants, the Democrats the donkeys. And here's a good political science word. We've got a map here with the word gerrymander. So reference to gerrymandering. In other words, drawing political districts in a way that sort of maximizes the number of seats a particular party is likely to win. And in front of all of this, in front of the sign, we've got Uncle Sam symbolizing America and these people turning up here. One of them saying, "Is this a bad time?" Obviously, the joke in the cartoon is that Joe Biden is holding this summit at a time when American democracy itself is not in a particularly healthy state. So yeah, that's sort of referring to all the things that are going on in the United States. Trump not conceding the election, sowing disinformation that the election was somehow stolen from him, districts being gerrymandered, all of this sort of stuff. So yeah, essentially saying that yes, the state of democracy inside the United States is not state. And it'll be interesting to see whether anything sort of comes of this meeting of democracy and what the United States and other countries can do to actually work towards strengthening democracy in other countries. Let's move on. And another headline we have here. The WHO's Europe chief says another storm coming as Omicron takes hold. WHO, obviously a reference to the World Health Organization. So its chief in Europe says another storm coming as Omicron takes hold. Takes hold, a good phrasal verb here, takes hold. In this context, meaning it is becoming established. Okay, its position, if you like, is becoming stronger. Hans Kluge advocates widespread boosters and warns COVID surge could push health systems to the brink. So advocates, so he's saying, it's a proposition. Widespread boosters. Boosters are extra vaccines. Okay, so a third vaccine dose designed to boost your immunity. Boost meaning increase or improve people's immunity, and warns COVID surge. To surge, meaning that you suddenly got more and more of these virus infections. This surge could push health systems to the brink. And as ever, I've got a Google Translate version of the headline. The first one looks to me like it's probably okay. Takes hold. They've translated Przejmuje kontrolę. And I'm just seeing what the surge would be in Polish. All right, wzrost. Yes, I suppose that would make sense. And read through a couple. There might be a bit of vocabulary here, which might prove to be useful. The World Health Organization's European head has warned countries to brace for a significant surge in COVID cases as Omicron spreads, and advised the widespread use of boosters for protection. Okay, I think that paragraph is reasonably clear. Since it emerged in late November, Omicron has been detected in at least 38 out of the 53 countries in the WHO's European region, and is already dominant in several of them, including Denmark, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. Hans Kluge told a news conference in Vienna on Tuesday. I should have given the reference explicitly that this is obviously from the Guardian website, today's version of the Guardian website. So 22nd of December 2021. We can see another storm coming, said Kluge. Within weeks, Omicron will dominate in more countries of the region, pushing already stretched health service systems further to the brink. So yeah, we talk about coming to the brink, literally the edge of something. But the brink meaning that if they go over, then the whole system could just collapse. The WHO's Europe region includes Russia and other former Soviet republics, as well as Turkey. WHO data shows the region has, in recent weeks, reported the highest number of COVID-19 cases compared to population size anywhere in the world. Even before Omicron, officials had warned of a further 700,000 deaths. So it sounds like Europe is in a worse condition than any other parts of the world in terms of virus infections. WHO headquarters in Geneva has advised that vaccine boosters be saved for the most vulnerable, but Kluge urged people to boost. So I say boost meaning increase, improve. The booster is the single most important defense against Omicron, he said. So yeah, again, reference to the ongoing pandemic, the Omicron virus, obviously causing a lot of concern. I happen to be in the UK at the moment, and it's dominating the UK news because it's spreading quite strongly in the UK at the moment. Okay, right, and this takes us back onto public policy. Okay, and one issue we could discuss relating to public policy is the issue of vaccines. So it's a good little case study here. And again, if we were all in class, we might have some kind of debate here. But the question here: should vaccines be compulsory? In other words, should people be made to have vaccines? Or perhaps, probably maybe a better question might be, should vaccine mandates or vaccine passports be introduced? So a vaccine passport would be essentially to say, I've been vaccinated and therefore I can go to a bar or to the cinema or theatre or places like that, in public areas. So in other words, you would be required to show. So probably not many politicians would say people would have to be forced to take vaccines, but you might say that, there are certain activities, public activities or activities with other people that you're not going to be allowed to do unless you have a vaccine passport, or possibly that you might, need to present, a recent negative test. And yes, so this would be an issue sort of relating to public policy. And if you recall, last week we talked about the public good, and one of the ideas we discussed was this notion that in some way your conception of the public good, so how you see the public good, is going to be related to a particular ideological view. And I think, again, vaccinations would be a really good illustration of this. So whether or not you support the idea of vaccine mandates or vaccine passports, to some degree that is going to be related to your particular ideological view of the world. So we've sort of broken down the arguments for and against, or the pros and cons, another way of saying that. So the arguments in favour of some kind of vaccine passport or whatever would be that in order to limit the spread of the disease, or ultimately eliminate the disease itself, most people need to be vaccinated in order to achieve what scientists refer to as herd immunity. So depending on how contagious a virus is, contagious meaning how easily it spreads from person to person, there's a certain limit whereby you've reached that limit and you've achieved herd immunity, essentially meaning that because most of the population are in some way immune, I can't say the word, they are immune to the virus, either because they've been vaccinated or because they've had the virus, they've been ill, they've been infected, and they have the antibodies. And depending on how contagious disease, then the different levels there are different levels you need to achieve herd immunity. The new variant seems to be, from what we can see, particularly contagious, and therefore you would need to have a fairly high level of herd immunity in order to stop the virus from spreading person to person. Probably, I suspect, I'm not a scientist, obviously, not in this area anyway, but I suspect well over 90% with the new variant. Well, there have to be some research done on that. The second point, unvaccinated people are more likely to transmit the virus. So again, a way of sort of breaking the chain of transmission from person to person is to have more and more people vaccinated. The more people who are vaccinated, the higher the level of immunity among the general population. Then obviously it will allow governments to adopt a sort of more relaxed approach, so you don't have to start closing schools or going into lockdown again and things like that. And above all else, and I think this was the chief reason why lockdowns were introduced in Britain a year ago, well, over a year ago now, is that by preventing the virus to spread, it will stop the hospital system from just collapsing. Obviously, if the virus is spreading, then more and more people are going to get sick. Some of them will become seriously ill and find themselves in hospital. And obviously, if hospitals are filled with sick COVID patients, then it means they're not going to have the capacity to deal with other diseases or other health problems that people have. So these these are all arguments in favour of making vaccines in some way sort of compulsory. The arguments against, people should have individual choice. Okay, so we shouldn't just be able to choose what they want to put into their body, and things like that. And that there is no role for government to dictate to us what we should or shouldn't have in terms of medication and things like that. So point number 2, similarly, again, people shouldn't be forced to take medications that they don't want. So if people are suspicious about the vaccine, and of course this is a new vaccine, so a lot of people are sort of wary about how safe it is. It's only been just put onto the market in this way. And related to that, again, problems of sort of trust. So if you start, putting pressure on people, people will naturally resist. Okay, so really two sets, and the two sides sort of have, I suppose, sort of different ideological views, and certainly different views on sort of rights and responsibilities of citizens. So in the con column, so the arguments against making vaccines compulsory, the arguments here are basically based on this idea of individual freedom. So these arguments sort of come out of a sort of liberal, if not libertarian, tradition of political thought, which essentially says that government power has to be minimized. Okay, that governments can't be compelled to make people do things that they don't want to do, especially, I suppose, in areas like the medical sphere. Okay, you can make the same sort of arguments about whether or not people should be allowed to take drugs and things like that. Okay, so these arguments sort of come from a libertarian viewpoint. The arguments on the other side would put more emphasis on individual responsibilities, so less emphasis on rights, more emphasis on responsibilities, and would say that actually, for the greater good, if you like, for the wider community, people should actually be in some way encouraged, maybe even compelled meaning made to take the vaccines. Because if we allow people to simply avoid the vaccine, then it will continue to spread, and the community as a whole will sort of suffer. So two sort of distinct, as I say, two sort of quite distinct viewpoints made here. And as I say, depending on your ideological view, so depending on your view of the public good, that will in some way sort of inform whether or not you think what the role of government is when it comes to vaccines, and the role of citizens, for matter. What are our duties, what are our rights as citizens? Okay, so as I say, vaccination is a good is a good case study in that regard, and obviously that's something in the news. Two further questions here, which both relate to public policy. So one here, what political issues do people care most about? Okay, so again, if we were in class, I would ask you, but generally, when people think about politics, or they think about which party they want to vote for, what are their main concerns? And I would imagine that the answers are pretty similar in most countries. Obviously, not everybody is identical, so not everybody cares about necessarily the same thing. But in general, I think you could say voters, when you ask them, what are the things that you worry about the most or are greatest concern to you? A lot of it will stem from things like government provisions. So if you ask people about things like people will reply along the lines of, we're worried about the quality of our hospitals or schools, things like that. Okay, maybe if you're living in an area where there's quite a lot of crime, you want government to sort of tackle that, and you might be thinking in terms of more police officers on the streets alternatively. And again, we saw this debate in the American election last year. Alternatively, there were some people in the United States who said actually the problem is the police, or the problem is that the police should be defunded, so take money away from the police and put the money into other other areas such as social services, drug counsellors, things like that, and that would be a more effective way of dealing with these sorts of problems. So again, another good example of how your ideological view might influence the sort of policies that you come to advocate. In the case of the UK, obviously Brexit has been an issue which has sort of dominated British politics for a couple of years now, and we found that the UK is quite polarised in terms of their views on Britain's relationship with Europe. So that in the British context, that might be an example. Sometimes people worry about defence, maybe in the case of Poland at the moment, given what's happening in relation to Russia and Ukraine, that could well also be an issue. So yeah, people often do care significantly about various policies. The second question, this is almost a sort of classical political science question. What are the most important duties of the state? So what does the state what should the state be doing for us, if you like? And again, various ways you could answer that. A lot of it depending on your ideological point of view. Thomas Hobbes, for example, I suppose an early attempt to answer this question. His fundamental argument was that the state provides security within the state, so internal security, but it can also provide external security. So it provides security from some form of outside attack. And Hobbes said that was the chief reason for having the state, the raison d'etre, if you like, of the state, was to provide security for its citizens. Without the state, without the Leviathan, as Hobbes referred to it, we live in the state of nature, which is a state of anarchy and a state of violence. I think we've mentioned that before, I think. Hobbes's answer was quite straightforward in that regard. The state's job here is to save us from ourselves, to provide security for us. Others, if you're a socialist, you might say that the state has a responsibility to redistribute wealth in order to achieve a more equitable society. So to make citizens more equal. So if you're a socialist, that's your ideological point of view. You want to you want a more egalitarian society. Egalitarian meaning more equality for citizens. Which basically means that you are going to tax the richest citizens the most, and use that money and redistribute it through some kind of welfare state. And the state should provide public services, public goods, if you like, for its citizens in terms of healthcare, education, things like that. That will lead to a sort of more just society. Obviously, if you're a liberal or a libertarian, you would fundamentally sort of disagree with this view, and you say, the state, a libertarian, for example, would views taxes almost like theft, that the state is forcibly taking money away from people and sort of redistributing it. From a libertarian point of view, the main duty of the state is to keep out of the lives of their citizens. A libertarian might say, okay, the state has a responsibility to provide some order in terms of security for a police force and things like that, and to have laws to allow markets and things like that to function. But beyond that, the state should not be interfering in the lives of its citizens. So as we've already discussed, different ideological views will lead to different answers to these kinds of questions. Okay, political issues. So these are all areas where public policy would be concerned with. So crime, we've just mentioned. So, if you live in a neighbourhood with high levels of crime, that is probably going to be something that will be of significant concern to you. Taxes, that's one area where people are going to disagree over the level of taxation, how much should be taken, what sort of tax system should you have. Do you have a progressive tax system where the richest pay more proportionately than the rest? Do you have a tax system which relies mainly mainly on indirect taxes, such as VAT, such as VAT, a value-added tax, and therefore people will only pay it if they choose to purchase various things. The economy, and again, different views about how the economy should be managed, how big a public sector should there be, things like that. National security, we mentioned. The environment, again, the responsibility of the state to protect the environment. What should we be doing in those areas? Education, healthcare system, income inequalities, we mentioned a moment ago. Discrimination, we'll come back to that in a moment. Civil liberties, so these are the individual freedoms. Again, if you're a liberal, you'll be concerned with those. Capital punishment, so should the state have the right to take the lives of its citizens if they have committed crimes? Again, most sort of countries, most Western countries, I should say, have abolished capital punishment. But the United States, I think Japan too, is another example of countries, I'll say democratic countries which still have it. And the welfare state. Public policy, then. Some different ways of viewing policy. So a mixed economy. So that comes back to how big a role should the state have when it comes to managing the economy. All economies are mixed, but the proportion of state involvement as opposed to the free market economy, that varies quite significantly between different countries. So France, for example, is a country with a very, very big public sector as a percentage. The United States, in contrast, a much smaller part of its economy is public. But as I said, they're all public. If you have a market economy, then obviously nonetheless sort of plays some kind of role. National debt, so how much should you borrow? Again, different views. Some more liberal, if not libertarian view is that printing money is always a bad thing. Also, taking out debt is always a bad thing. Socialists or social democrats might say, well, actually, there are occasions where it is necessary to borrow, and if you are investing in in the public sector or investing in infrastructure, then that can be seen as an investment which is actually going to result in higher levels of economic growth in the future. Law and order, crime and punishment, we mentioned. Incarceration, there's a good word. Incarceration meaning locking people up. So again, it's one thing to have lots of police on the street, but if people are arrested, then it leads to a debate as to what do you do with them. And again, arguments, depending on your ideological views and what have you, then you're going to arrive at different answers to this question. Many conservatives would argue that prison is an effective deterrent, meaning that people won't commit crimes if they think there's a real possibility that they will be arrested and have to serve some serious jail time. Others would argue that actually in locking people away, first of all, it's very expensive to put somebody behind bars. Secondly, it tends to make people even worse. So if sooner or later you sort of release them, then somebody who's been in prison is more likely to commit crimes again. So some people say it's best to avoid locking people away if you can. Obviously, there are some people who you might really, really have to if they are if they represent a real danger to the rest of society. But prison should be seen as a sort of last resort, something that you do when you have no other choice. And affirmative action. This is an American phrase, really, concept, but basically a form of positive discrimination. So if you think that there are certain people, usually ethnic minorities, so black, brown, Asian people, who are underrepresented in a particular area of life, perhaps in a school or university or something like that, you might choose to sort of positively discriminate in favour of them, or to say to your university that 20% of your students have to be black or brown or something like that. And again, there are that's led to a very sort of heated debate. With some people saying these sorts of policies are necessary in order to sort of combat or overcome forms of structural racism which are built into certain systems. Others say that any form of discrimination, even if it's positive discrimination, is a bad thing, that you should basically give a job to the most talented person, regardless of their skin colour. And I think there is a sort of text, isn't there, which accompanies this class, which talks about this debate in the United States, which is still very much ongoing. In fact, the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that has sort of highlighted the degree to which racism is still very much present in the United States, but also in other countries as well. There's quite a big BLM movement in the UK as well, for example. And some questions here which you can consider at home. But should governments implement affirmative action programs, which we just mentioned? So again, what are the arguments for and against? Should the richest people in society pay high taxes? Again, what are the arguments for and against? The social democratic argument would be that the wealthiest have a sort of duty or a responsibility to care for those people in society who are more vulnerable. The sort of more liberal or libertarian argument would be if they've made the money themselves, then they should be allowed to keep it. That wealth creators, wealth producers need to be incentivized. And if you start taking money away in the form of taxes, money away from them in the form of taxes, then they are going to be less likely to open businesses and create wealth. Should civil liberties be suspended if terrorists are a major threat to national security? Again, we've seen these sorts of debates countless times. You saw it after 9/11 when Congress passed the Patriot Act, which one of the things contained in the act was that it gave more powers to America's sort of national security agencies to monitor people and to engage in various activities which many people sort of objected to on the grounds of civil liberties. Counter argument was that these powers were necessary in order to ensure there wasn't another 9/11. And again, you can find plenty of other similar sort of examples. Should recreational drugs be decriminalized, legalized? Again, the libertarian argument here is very clear on this. They would say, of course. Others would say, well, actually, if you do legalize or even decriminalize these sorts of drugs, there are other sort of negative consequences which society has to deal with. The risk of drug overdoses, risk of people sort of trying one drug and then going on to harder drugs, things like that. So in other words, basically saying the libertarian argument is is slightly more complicated than the libertarians would sort of like to present. So yeah, all these issues. I mean, these are all very obvious sort of political issues. Issues which sort of tend to generate very strong arguments on both sides. And again, as we said, the policies that you pursue are going to depend on what your view of the public good is, and your view of the public good is going to be largely determined by the particular ideological view that okay, I will leave it there. So thank you very much.